The stories contained in this podcast are the recollections of the guests we've invited onto the show. We are an outlet for people to share their truths, and we accept no legal responsibilities for the stories contained herein.
I'm Kendra Sheets.
And I'm Rich Gill.
And this is Enough, a podcast that aims to shine light into the darkened corners of the music industry while discussing the ways we can and should improve ourselves and, in turn, our community.
This podcast may contain graphic descriptions of sexual abuse and assault, including rape. These accounts can be triggering, especially for those who have also experienced sexual trauma.
If at any point during this podcast you feel yourself getting triggered, we suggest taking a break and taking care of yourself before continuing. But we do ask that you continue if you are able. These conversations can be mentally and emotionally taxing, but they are so important to have.
Welcome back to another episode of the Enough podcast. Today we have Michelle as our guest. Michelle has previously come forward about her experiences with someone very well known in the music industry, in the music scene. We're going to let Michelle tell her story. The reason why we feel it's so important to have Michelle tell her story today is that though this happened almost 40 years ago, the members of this band they've reached international superstardom. Each one of them has told this story in their own way, in books, in interviews, on podcasts, but Michelle hasn't gotten a chance to tell her story of the person who actually experienced this. So today we have Michelle as our guest who's going to outline everything that she experienced all those years ago. Michelle, would you like to start off and give us a little bit of information about how you got into music, what you were interested in, what drew you to it all those years ago, and why you've stayed?
Yeah, I would be happy to. Thank you for having me here, Kendra and Rich. I'm really grateful. Wow, my mother was a very young mom, and her love of music passed over to me, being raised in a household full of music. She was always playing albums. I think I grew up listening to a lot of the Rolling Stones and Zeppelin, and I'm a huge fan of all these bands. And then grew into loving punk rock music and metal as I started becoming a teen. Yeah, like early metalhead with all the Judas Priest and Black Sabbath and Dio and all of that stuff from my mom, and then growing into even more of a metalhead, and then loving the Ramones, huge Ramones fan.
Like we're kindred spirits. It's like you're telling our
made
story.
For us.
Yeah.
It's my definite happy music for sure. In 1979, I talked my mom into letting me dress up as a punk rocker for Halloween. And Halloween's my favorite holiday ever in the world.
Me too.
1979, she made me like a dress out of a plastic hefty bag and like did my hair all crazy. She was a hairdresser and makeup artist. And it's awesome. Early love of the punk rock and metal. I remember very clearly watching an MTV video of Motley Crue, actually, and it was Live Wire, and I kind of lost my little 12-year-old mind. I lost it. I was like, oh my God. I was very overly grown up, I guess, for my age, is what I heard a lot. I watched that video and I was like, what? That's happening in Hollywood? I'm going.
Is that the video where Nikki Sixx's pants are like on fire?
Is it that one?
Or is that the Looks That Kill video?
I think that's Looks That Kill, which I love so much. I'm not sure, but I remember they were really young and they were like satanic.
Yeah.
And I just remember being like, wow, my whole lid got flipped, and I practically headed for Hollywood right away. I mean, there were other things that happened. In the meantime, I was getting kicked out of my house a lot because I was rotten and horrible and, ran away all the time and went to shows. And I started going to shows in Huntington Beach really early. and hitchhiking to Huntington Beach from like Redlands and then Chino. And I just hitchhiked everywhere and was kind of a really wild and feral kid. And so I just remember being thrown out a lot and finally being like, I'm out of here. And moving to Hollywood, and it was all Molly Crew's fault. No.
I think they're to blame for a lot of people moving to Hollywood at that time.
Yeah, I think so. And still, honestly.
Still, it's true.
I loved them. They like honestly changed my little life. And I just, yeah, it was like the next step. And so I was seeing bands like Rat and Sin and
wow, I haven't heard that name in a long time.
So Sin actually became sort of like my family. They changed their name to Jaguar later, but
they were also related to, I swear to God, at work today, I was listening to the first Rough Cut record.
Oh, wow.
They were sort of part of that whole scene too.
It's kind of wild. Yeah. That whole early scene. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, once I kind of centered myself in Hollywood, my music taste started changing a lot because I was immersed in the scene being a little street kid. And I had a lot of bizarre experiences. I mean, even still, I look back at my life and I'm amazed that I'm here to tell this story anyway. But from 12 to like 14, I was basically on my own, and living wherever I could. And I was never left out of a bar. I only had one experience ever where a bar owner was like, hey, hold up. How old are you really? Let's really sit down and talk. And that was actually, I always called him Grandpa Mario from the Rainbow. But yeah, he was one of the only people that was like, wait a second. How old are you really? And I was really young. And so, but yeah, he was like, you can't come into my bar.
My son just turned 14 recently, and to imagine like that kid out just running the streets, like, wow, it really puts it into perspective how young that is. And
it's really wild. I mean, being that kid and then being a mother all these years, every one of my boys as they hit 15, and my youngest is 15 now, it is really intense to think about because by 12, I was definitely leaving home a lot and hitchhiking. I've told folks around this that there were a lot of serial killers in LA and picking up people off the freeways that I was hitchhiking. It was just incredibly stupid. And yet I was so driven and fearless, and I knew that I didn't want to live a life at home. I was really rebellious.
Everything that we've talked about both today and then in our pre-interview, you really paint this picture of what Hollywood, Los Angeles was like during that time frame, whether it's, a 10-year span or even longer. And it translates over, I think, really well to like punk music as well. Because like there's this book, We Got the Neutron Bomb, which outlines the early ages of punk in Los Angeles. And your stories are so similar. And when you talk about like feral kids running the streets, all under 21, all like wasted, just running around, going to shows, tons of makeup, ripped up clothes. Like it was very much the way of that part of the city at that time. Like Hollywood was the music mecca of not only Southern California, but also a lot of the world. You had people from all over, myself years and decades later included, transposing themselves across the country to go to try and absorb some of that culture.
There's a reason that, take for example, a band like Poison, who is from Pittsburgh, it was like, well, we're not going to make it in Pittsburgh, but if we move to LA,
you got the Sunset Strip.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So especially at that time period, that was where it was all happening.
It drew so many. It drew so many from everywhere. And you're right, it was this mecca. And I had tons and tons of friends that were in the punk rock scene, like full head into the, punk rock scene. They bled into each other. That's what's neat about, I think, the music scene in Hollywood at that time. in the 80s was that like super butt rock, metal into glammy stuff that drew me there in the first place. But then all of this different music, all of these different bands were playing together. That's where, you could go to a show and see the Fuzz Tones and the Pandoras and Tex and the Horseheads and all of these, just Celebrity Skin and all these amazing bands that were unlike anything else playing together. Fuzz Tones doing all this like awesome garage rock and blending in with like Red Cross, Social Distortion, and I think that was really unique for its time. Such an amazing scene at that time as far as the music goes. There's a dark, nasty underbelly all over just Hollywood in itself. I mean, that's part of what honestly drew me to Hollywood. I am this weirdo kid that had a love affair with Hollywood in itself, and like walked around with Hollywood Babylon as my Bible, and like went strange places and like broke in old hotels. And, I wanted to immerse myself in that bizarre place. I was drawn to Hollywood really young. I was lucky enough to have some good people looking out for me. I had a ton of really, really terrifying experiences even before I was 14 years old. And I go back to that time because the very first time I ever saw this particular person, I was living at a place called the Shamrock Studios, and they really became family. So that was Sin, the band Sin, who ended up changing their name later to Jaguar. And that's Vincent's band. He just became someone that was really looked after me. And he allowed me to be there. It sounds kind of whacked right now, but I was 13 and 14 years old and hanging out at this place. During the day, it was their rehearsal space and a couple other people's rehearsal space. And then at night, after the bars, you could just, I think it was like $5. I don't know. People could pay their money and then just like hang out all night. There's kegs, and everybody who was kind of anybody showed up at this place. It's in a bunch of different books. It was in an area of Hollywood that was definitely not the best. And I mean, people like Wasp were always there, and like Chris Holmes was always there, Blackie Lawless and El Duce from the Mentors, and like, all these different people would show up there. And so they all became kind of this family to me in my mind. Like they watched out for me when I was out at clubs, things like that. And like around this time, and I'm not sure if I was still living there or if I had moved in with this one girl that I had met at the Rainbow outside, and she was actually a call girl, and she lived at a hotel off Sunset. Right around that time, I was between places, and I went into a video store off Sunset Boulevard, Tower Video, and I saw this person, and I had a really intense moment. A lot of feelings. Like I felt like I was on drugs, a lot of drugs all of a sudden. I got really, really high. I felt like I was on acid and speed or something. I was very overwhelmed. I started sweating like I was having a hot flash. Only I was, 14 years old, so I definitely wasn't there yet. And I felt like I had known this person forever. I don't know. My body was going through something, and my heart was beating really fast, and I was like, I gotta get out of here. And I remember being like, God, I hope he doesn't see me. Like in that movie Dracula where he's like, don't see me. I felt like I was like cloaking myself and like, no.
Did you know who he was? Or was it just a thing where you ran into a person where you just had a guttural reaction to them?
Yeah, no, he was just like this guy that worked at the video store. Okay. He definitely worked there too. I remember being there long enough to understand that he wasn't just there shopping for videos. And the way that place was set up, there was no real way for anyone not to see you coming down the stairs. It was a very big stairwell, like open. Anyway, I stumbled out of there basically and kind of had a full panic attack and was like, what do I do? Like, do I go in there every day? Do I just like fawn on him every day? Do I go in there and like make him mine? Like, it was one of those things. Like, I had all of these feelings. And I felt like, okay, I need to not go back in this place. I need to not hunt this person. And if he's meant for me, he'll come to me. Right. And it was like that. It was like the hardest thing I'd ever had to do in my whole life at that moment. And I know it seems ridiculous, but really it was like the hardest thing I ever had to do. And I thought about him all the time. I dreamt of
hormones. We have to remember your age. It's hormones.
I just wanted to go there every day. And I forced myself. It was like kicking a drug or something. I was like, no, I will not do it. And so I didn't. And a lot happened in a very short amount of time. Fast forward, I ended up getting really ill. I left Hollywood because this 40-something-year-old man and his 20-something-year-old girlfriend was trying to make me their like crackhead sex slave. So I left Hollywood and I called a friend who was like an early boyfriend of mine. He was in a couple of videos. I think he was in a Motley Crue video, maybe a Van Halen video. Anyway, he was just this sweet kid, a little bit more my age. He was probably one of the youngest guys that I had ever really been with. And he lived not in Hollywood. He was living right outside of Pasadena. And so he said that I could come there. I went there and I left Hollywood altogether. I ended up back with my mom and I was trying to be a good girl. I had been so used and through so much. At that point, I had never had anyone really even act like they really loved me. I'd only understood what it was to be raped and to be kind of used as a little fuck doll.
How long were you in LA at this point before you left?
At that point, I had been there for a couple of years. I took off around 12. And then by the time I got back home, I was almost 15. So I ended up back home with my mom in Chino. And I was going to Chino High and I was trying to be a good kid and go to like teenage clubs and have teenage friends. And it was a mind fuck. It was really, really difficult for me to go from doing anything and everything I wanted, whenever I wanted, to this ideal that I needed to be pure and good for anyone to take me seriously, for anyone to love me, for anyone to respect me. I needed to be pure and I needed to be good and I needed to behave myself. And so that was why I was doing it. And I started going to clubs again and I would go up with a couple friends and like I kind of talked them into driving me up to Hollywood and then I would come home. And then I remember basically manipulating my mom into coming out with me and being like, you have to, like, you're so beautiful and gorgeous and your husband left you and you should come and meet my friends that are all grown-ups. Anyway, introduced her to the person who basically ran Shamrock Studios. I was kind of a dad to me anyway, and I didn't realize that they would actually fall in love, and they did. And my plans were to basically, I was like, okay, I'm going to get her to move to Hollywood, and then I'll still be good because I'll be living with my mom and going to high school there, and I'll be good kid, but still get to go to my shows and maybe even get a job there, whatever. That was my whole thing. And it was working. And yeah, we were about to move. She decided that she would move to Hollywood after I got out of school. And that's what we did. And right during that time, I went up. I don't even, to this day, I don't remember who I even rode up with, but there was a show going on at a place called the Lipstick Fix. I remember I showed up and I was all in white. I was really playing this like, I'm a good girl thing.
Yeah,
and
I was going to say, just very...
I really was. I mean, for me...
Saintly and just like pure.
I had really blonde hair and I bleached my hair. And I remember having this like gauzy Stevie Nicks sort of dress, and nobody was wearing that kind of stuff. No, like no one. And so it was very like a little like sweet doll. I don't know. I was really young and I was like, yeah, I'm going to play this up. I'll play up the Lolita thing. But I'm really good. Anyway, I showed up at that show and he was the doorman and I freaked out. I remember it taking a very long time for me to even walk up and get in line. And I had those the same feelings that I'd had in the video store. And it was like a year later. And there he is. And I haven't seen him at any show. I haven't seen him anywhere. All of a sudden, there he is. And he's about to like grab my hand. He grabbed my hand and I felt like the world kind of drifted away. And he told me how beautiful my dress was and how beautiful I was in it. And he looked like he was looking at an angel. I had never been really looked at like that. And it just felt really mystical. I remember coming back to myself and being really kind of like catty. He said something about my giant long nails. And he was like, are these yours? And I was like, yeah, I paid for them. They're mine.
I have the receipt.
Trying to be like, I'm so cool, whatever. I don't even know you. Right. He was just holding my hand for an awfully long time. And the line was getting bigger and bigger. And I was like, I should probably go in. And he's like, okay. And I went in. And then the whole night, I just kept gravitating back to that door and being like, there he is. Oh my God. And the night was over. And I was like, I have to go home. I'm a good girl now. So I'm leaving. And I see him with like 3 or 4 girls. And I was like, oh, okay, I'm not going to walk up to him. Like, I'm not doing that. And as I was leaving, he came up to me. He's like, want to come to this after party? And I'm like, no, I have to go to high school tomorrow. And he's like, oh, okay. Do you have a phone? And I was like, yeah. And he waited. And he's like, does it have a number? Yeah, it does. And he's like, well, can I have it? And I'm like, yeah. And then he gives me his number. And I remember I spelled his name wrong in my little phone book. And I wrote Rad Babe. The weird thing about his phone number, I didn't call him either. I was like, I'm not calling. I'm a good girl. And I went home. I didn't go to the after party. I went to school. I didn't hear from him for almost 2 weeks. And I refused to call him. I was not going to call. He called about 2 weeks after that. And I remembered having that whole moment where you're just like, oh my God. You know, I answered the phone. He's like, hey, is Michelle there? And I'm like, yeah, hold on a second. And I go scream in the bathroom and, you know, come back out. And I'm like, hey. And we talked for hours. Like, he was over at this guy, West Arkeen's house. And he was like hiding in some corner because it sounded like a giant party, which was that house all the time. Like, there was always people there. And there was always music happening and being created there. And anyway, we talked for hours and hours. It felt like 2.5 hours. And I ended up getting in trouble for that phone call later, way later on, when West got the phone bill and was like, what? And I was like, I didn't make the phone call from your house. I'm not paying that bill. But anyway, I told him that I was moving back up to Hollywood, and we talked a lot until then and made plans that as soon as I came into town that I would get a hold of him. And he was very excited to have me there. And I was stars in my eyes. I was so in love, like the sound of his voice. He was so smart and deep and knowledgeable. And like, I had never been able to even have a conversation with anyone like this. And so in my mind, I'm thinking, oh my God, my teenage fairy tale is so coming true. This is amazing. And when we moved up there, I talked my mother into letting me deal with the first load while she went back for the other load. as soon as Vincent her left, I immediately got in one of my sluttiest, but white. It was white.
Always with the wife. Yeah.
It was pure.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, it was like cut all the way down my back and it was all laced up and it looked like a club dress and it was definitely a nighttime dress, but it was white. So I could wear it. And I called his number and his phone number, by the way, was really weird. It was like a service. And I thought that was very strange. I would call and then someone would answer the phone and it was like a phone call service. And then they would beep him or something or get a hold of him. And then he would call the phone back and he called right away. And I picked it up and he was like, get over here. And I was like, okay. And I walked to his place and there was a few people there, some girls there that I would know later on. It was uncomfortable and strange and weird. I felt a lot of not animosity, but like, what are you doing here? And even though I was really young, there was not a moment where I was thinking, well, it's obviously I'm too young. There was never that. I really believed myself, always to be this ancient being and like, whatever, like these girls just don't like me at first, whatever. I don't care. It was never a matter of these are grown women being like, you are a child. Now that I look back at it, I think, well, yeah, that's definitely what was happening there. So that was my first night with him and we hung out all night. The girls left. They got a bottle and I drank White Russians. I thought I was really fancy asking for that. So we sat around and drank White Russians.
Because it had white in the title.
Yeah.
So it's okay.
Right.
I was like, it's okay. I don't even know how I wore white at that time anyway. I'm someone who, if I wear it now, I look at it and it gets stained. I'm not that person. My mom could wear white gauze and smoke cigarettes and ash would get on her and she'd give it a look and it would jump off her arm. Me, no, I'm in it 5 minutes and I'm stained. So I don't know how I did it then. But yeah, White Russians. I remember at one point in the night being like, I'm going to lay down. And the night was like a fairy tale. He was very sweet to me. He took his time with me in ways I'd never been treated like this before. No one had ever been this kind to me, treated me with what I assumed was respect. I don't know. We did have sex that night, but it took hours of just staring into each other's faces and playing with each other's hands and breathing into each other's mouths. And it was this very spiritual experience. And I just remember almost being out of body a lot and being like, this is so incredible. This is what it's about. This is what I've always wanted. And then the next morning, I knew I was in a lot of trouble. My mom was going to kill me. And so I was like, I need to go. And he was like, well, I'll walk you to the bus stop and I'll give you bus money. And I'm like, okay. And then on the way to the bus stop, he was like, why don't you come do laundry with me? And I was like, okay. So I went and did laundry with him. And then he walked me to the bus stop. And I remember the bus pulling up and he just didn't want to say goodbye. He picked me up and paid for both of us and led me through the bus. And we sat in the very back and he took me home. And on the way home, he picked a rose out of this gorgeous garden on Kings Road, I lived off Kings Road between Santa Monica and Melrose. And there was this gorgeous garden there. And he just like went into someone's garden and stole me a rose. And I was like, oh my God. Like I was the little girl that watched old silent films and like watched these like Robin Hood and like, oh man, I was just so like, I saved that thing forever too. Anyway, he took me home and we ended up having sex all over my mother's house. Everywhere there was her bed before she ever even slept in it, all over the place. I remember taking him down to the workout room and showing him that we had a jacuzzi that had a locked door. It was wild. That was a whole wild thing. And from that time on, we hung out a lot with each other, a lot. I was at one of the first shows where the band that most people know as the core of this band. They had their first show in June. It was the first Thursday at the Troubadour that they would play. I was there for a lot of their very first shows, and we were together a lot. Either he would call me or I was with him earlier in that day, and he'd be like, please come to my show. I'll put you on my list. I became very close friends with the rest of his band. Two of the members from his band were friends of mine from Shamrock Studios. They were best friends with each other since junior high. And I became one of their friends at 14. And so by the time, I find out this guy's in a band with them, I'm like, oh my God, they're my brothers. Like, I love those fuckers, they're my guys. So I was very excited that he wanted me to go see his, first show. I didn't know he was even in a band until like later. And then he ends up being in this band with my brothers. And I'm like, oh my God, I love this. This is the greatest thing ever. We all hung out a lot. A lot of people have said they're kind of like a gang because they kind of were. I mean, they all like hung out with each other. They all had each other's back. They were very tight. And I hit it off very well with the bass player. And the other guitar player was very quiet and to himself. There were a lot of drugs involved in the band, but in the very beginning, I wasn't seeing it ripping people apart. To put it kind of mildly, heroin was a huge thing in Hollywood at that time. And a lot of my friends were drinking a lot and doing a lot of heroin. I, however, was not. I was drinking a lot at that time. Our relationship as the band started getting more and more popular changed some. I should back up a little bit. Before the first show, he told me that he changed on stage and that before a show, he would have to get himself into this almost like character. And that after the show, it took him some time to come down from it. And that he apologized profusely in advance. That if he was weird to me, if he was cold, if he was strange in any way, that he was sorry. And I remember taking that in and being like, that's kind of amazing that he knows this about himself. I know a lot of very shy people that really have to almost put on this mask to be on stage. The scary thing is when the person that is coming in starts to take over. The more popular they got, and they got popular very fast. Hollywood seemed like a big place then, but it really wasn't. Now it's like a ghost town. But the more popular they got, the kind of more estranged guy. He was always really sweet with me. He was always really kind, but I was seeing him a little less. And that is when I realized at that time I was getting sick at school and like vomiting a lot at school. And I went and took a pregnancy test, and I was far over the point of being able to have an abortion, even if I had wanted to.
Michelle, how old were you at that point?
I was just going to ask that.
Yeah, I was 15. He was 23. It hit me so hard knowing like, okay, I'm pregnant, like I'm having a baby. I'm going to have a baby. And I'm not sure what to do. I started planning and okay, I'm gonna have this baby. I'm gonna move out of Hollywood. I'm gonna go stay with my stepdad guy in Ventura, and I'm gonna, have my baby there. And all the while I wasn't seeing a lot of him, and I was terrified to tell him. I was so scared because in this time period, for some girl to be like, I'm pregnant, most guys in that scene would have been like, it's not my baby. Or like, how do I know it's my baby? Or how many other guys were you fucking? How is it my baby? Or you need to get an abortion. I mean, a good guy at that time, and I'm not joking you, okay? A good guy at that time was like, I will pay for half of the abortion. I mean, you're lucky if somebody was going to be like, oh, I'll figure out, I'll fit the bill. Like, where are they going to come up with the money from anyway? Their stripper girlfriends? I don't know. But that is really where it was at. at that time. So I was scared. I remember I showed up to a show and it was their first sold out show. And I hadn't heard from my friend that day. And I hadn't heard from him that day. And I went to the show anyway. And I walked up and I was like, I'm on the list. And the guy was like, no, you're not. And I was like, what? What do you mean I'm not on the list? And he was like, yeah, you're not. And I was like, could you check it again? And he's like, I'll triple check that. You're not on the list. Luckily, the guy in back of me, I don't know, bless him. Like he was like, I'll pay our way in. And he paid my way in. And I remember I went in and it was so very weird. It was a weird energy in there. And I didn't see my friend there at all. And yet I could feel her there. Like I knew she was there. And in the Troubadour, the green room, like backstage is upstairs. So I just felt it. I was like, she's up there. And I remember the guitar player went into this whole thing that was like, blah, blah, blah. Our singer really fell for this girl and he had it so bad for her. And now things are weird and blah, blah, blah. And they went into this song that was very rude. I felt like it was directed right at me. And I remember I like came from the upstairs and I raced down to the front of the stage and like flipped the band off and took off. And I remember that night I woke up screaming and I had a vision. I had a dream. It was a very, very realistic dream that my best friend of me was having sex with him. And I just knew. A few days later, I ran into their roadie and he was like, why didn't you show up at West's? And I was like, oh, well, I wasn't invited. And he was like, what do you mean you weren't invited? And I was like, just like I said, I wasn't invited, and I mentioned my friend's name and he told me what happened and I knew it. He was like, oh, like he told me that they had slept together.
No, this is the friend you told about your pregnancy, right?
Yes. She's the one that went with me to go get the pregnancy test. So she is the only person at this time
Who knows
that I'm pregnant. And so like a week later, he called me and he was like, we got to talk, and I'm like, okay. I remember being very cold and being shocked that he didn't see me flip them off. Like I thought I was making a huge scene. And so he never mentioned that in the phone call. And he was like, I'm going for the holidays. I'll be back and I'll get a hold of you. And anyway, he left and I went to a show. I had stopped drinking. I was, preparing for the fact that I was going to have a baby. And I show up at this show, I think it's LA Guns and the Joneses at the Troubadour. And the whole band shows up. I remember I was sitting outside at the bus stop. There's a bus stop out there at the moment. And they all showed up and sat with me at the bus stop. And they were just giving me shit. They were just ribbing me, and being like, where's your husband? Just giving me shit.
Like in a playful way or in
a playful way, in a bratty, playful way, which also made me realize, did they not see that I flipped them off?
Right.
I'm thinking in my head, like, wow, this is kind of weird. And so I get up to go into the show and this guitar player had a very specific way of greeting me all the time. So that night I'm about to go in and he would always pick me up. This guitar player would always scoop me up in his arms and twirl me around. And I'm very short. I've never been tiny ever. Even when I weighed 105 pounds, I was not what I would consider tiny. I was very big breasted, very big butt, very little tiny waist, very, very curvy. And he picked me up and he was so rude. He like spun me around and put me down. He was all excited. And then he looked at me and he goes, you getting fat or what? And I was like, or what? And I grabbed his hand and I put it on my belly. And I just remember his face. God, I loved this guitar player. I loved him so much. He was like a brother to me. He was closer to me than some of my girlfriends. And I remember the feeling of his hand on my stomach. And it was the first person ever that, not even my girlfriend, who ended up sleeping with, at that time, the love of my life, had put her hand on my belly like that. So I had his hand on my belly, and all these feelings went through me. And there was not one moment, like, he wasn't like, oh my God, Michelle, whose is it? You know, he was like, oh my God, what are you guys going to do? And I was like, well, I am going to have a baby. And he just fucked my friend. So I don't know what he's going to fucking do. But you're going to keep your mouth shut, and you're going to allow me to tell him that I'm going to have a baby. Please don't say anything. That night was probably one of the most bizarre nights of my life. I have described it as being Lynchian. And then I went in and I was watching the band, and I had a couple girlfriends. I didn't come with them, but I met them there. And I had some of the worst pain I'd ever had during that show, and I buckled over. And now, mind you, at that time, I had had very bad ovarian cysts, which led me to be in the hospital years ago when I went back to my mom's. So I was living with my friend in Arcadia, and I was going through a lot of pain. Burst cysts are horribly painful. And this was worse than that. It was worse than any pain I had ever had in my life. And I had a really high tolerance for pain. I buckled over. I was like seeing stars. I was sick. And they helped me to the bathroom, and I miscarried in the Troubadour bathroom. And my friend at the time came in, and she was like, just go. Like, I'll deal with this.
The following clip was taken from an interview conducted by Serena Markstrom in 2019.
Do you remember that night in the Troubadour?
I do. I do. By the time I saw Michelle, I feel like I had already been walking around for a while, and I think...
Do you remember how you ended up in the bathroom with her?
I came to check on her. Like, it was like she was taking a while, but then I also remember us being like in stalls right next to each other. And then her telling me after she came out of the stall.
Mm-hmm. What did she tell you?
She was miscarrying, and I was like, oh my God. And she said that she was having a miscarriage right then, and I was like, oh my God. And I didn't know her extremely well at that point. I mean, we'd hung out, we'd done stuff, we'd gone out places a lot together, but you know, it's not like we were inseparable all the time. And I knew that she had been seeing though, and she was not, it's not like she was always just sleeping around, you know what I mean? And her heart was definitely like, she was a flutter for him. And I was like, oh my God, this is heavy. Like, are you okay? So my main concern was just like, are you okay? Are you going to be all right? Do we need to leave? You know, what do you need me to get for you? What do you need me to do?
And what did she say? What did she need?
She said she was okay, but she was having awful cramps. She looked like pale. She looked pale and green. I mean, you know what I mean? It was just, you know, because I can only imagine, you know, she had just lost a lot of blood. And she described a type of a clot. Because I was like, are you sure? You know, how do you know? Are you sure it's not just like a heavy period? She's like, no, I haven't had my period. I'm pregnant. And this is, you know, something obviously came out that was, you know, basically a clot type of a thing wrapped around something, you know, that was more than just a regular period. I feel like she had thrown up. You know, she was not well. We were not crazy out of control, especially not Michelle. I mean, I honestly don't even remember her drinking that much. You know what I mean? It was, and we certainly could have, you know. But as far as vouching for her, you know, in that way, it was like she was not the fucked up, druggy girl at all. She was sweet.
I was so in shock. I remember getting up and walking out the door, and the drummer was coming through the club and like saw me, and his eyes lit up, and he just kind of scooped me around my waist. You know, he was walking towards me and then put his hand around my waist and just pulled me to the front, through the bar and into the front bar of the Troubadour. where the rest of the band was sitting except the other guitar player. So there's 3 members of this band sitting at this table with me, and their demo is on in the front bar. And it's the first time I've heard their music on a stereo. And that was so bizarre. And then the song that I loved so much that I always felt was played for me, even though it wasn't written for me, he sang it a lot to me and it always made me cry. So that was playing and they were singing it to me. It was all very like over the top, you know, they were all in my face and like singing this song to me and being my bratty brothers. And I'm turning green. And I remember I was like, I gotta go. And I got up and there's a little bathroom in the front bar of the Troubadour. And I stumbled into there and I threw up a bunch. And when I came out, my friend was standing there. I remember her being like green and she was like, we should go. And I was like, okay. And she took me home and I processed that for days, losing my baby in a toilet. I didn't know what I was going to say to him. I was scared to say anything. And then when he came back is when I decided I've got to go talk to him. The reason why I'm telling this story, just like what you said in the beginning, my story has been written about. So almost every book that's been written by any other band member, except the person that is more involved than anybody, they all write about this happening. It's late at night. I'm wasted. None of that is real. Part of why this story is so important to me is to not only stand up for all of the other women that he's hurt and all people that are being hurt, all of us survivors as standing together, but also to correct the story that they have not stopped telling. They started spinning this story before they even got really famous, and they got famous really fast.
The second half of this interview will be released 1 week from today.
Enough is a podcast centering on surviving abuse, harassment, and assault in the music scene. To help get the word out, please like and subscribe and share with your friends. If you have been on the receiving end of harm from someone, be it artist, venue owner, booking agent, audience member, or someone else, and would like to share your story on a future episode, please reach out to us at thisisenoughpodcast@gmail.com. All correspondences are kept confidential.